All right, we're all here. So maybe we do a short round of presentations. First, Jaya.
Hi, my name is Jaya Brekke. I do research on blockchain, political analysis of different blockchain protocols. I am very interested in defining a political crypto economics. So how to understand protocols, networks, as well as tokens in a kind of like sense of governance, in a sense of power, in a sense of the new kinds of relationships that these technologies can enable, and what are the kind of limits to what these technologies can enable as well. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the discussion.
Hi, I'm Ruth Catlow. I'm an artist and founder of Furtherfield. We're an arts, technology and social change organisation that got started in the mid-90s as the web was getting going. So we connected with artists, techies and activists from around the world and kind of built platforms before blogs were a thing, before social media was a thing, and made the spaces that we needed in order to discuss and collaborate together. Inspired and kind of enabled by the growth of free and open source software and all the kind of cultures and philosophies that surrounded that. Back in 2013, we started a program in which we asked people to help us think through what a commons for the arts might look like in a networked age, especially paying attention to blockchain and kind of emerging data practices and technologies. And then since then, we've been really looking at the relationship between art, money, both from a pragmatic and a kind of philosophical level, and we've produced films, exhibitions, a book called Artists Rethinking the Blockchain, and a lab series called DAOWO, so this is decentralized autonomous organizations with others, so like a real focus on collaboration and how we build solidarity. And this is the focus for our work this year, so how artists can form decentralized autonomous organizations on the blockchain for solidarity in new economies.
Hey, I'm Peter from the ArtxN Alliance, or ANA, and we're a team building open tools for a new arts economy with a particular focus on the agency of artists and the diffusion of visual culture. So we're very interested in the sort of space between artists and audience and how we kind of bridge that. And two of the projects that we're working on at the moment is called one is called Zine, and the other is called Blank Chain, and maybe there's an opportunity to sort of talk a little bit about those today.
My name's Adam Broomberg. I'm one half of a photographic duo, and I've spent 20 years working with a large format analog camera, and so I know probably less than anyone in the audience about what we're about to talk about. But I did do a project recently that's both made of, it's about data and it's traded using the blockchain, so we'll get onto that. Should we start with that piece?
Yeah, sure. Can we get the slides? Thank you.
Is there sound?
I am not sure. Is there sound?
There should be. What are you seeing?
Your presentation.
Okay, now this should play.
I think I should duck.
This has got sound, guys. Okay, well, I'll speak in a Russian accent. This is Yekaterina Samovamovich. She's one of the Pussy Riot members. And we discovered a private company in Russia that was developing a surveillance technique where they put two tiny cameras into doors and people walked through and it would map their entire face and basically make a three-dimensional representation that could be rotated in space. It's not moving. Just push play on it. Push the space bar.
This is Yekaterina Samotsevich, a member of Pussy Riot. This portrait was created by a machine. a facial recognition system recently developed in Moscow for public security and border control surveillance. This image was made without her knowledge, consent, or cooperation. This technology was designed for surveillance, but it was also created to photograph people who would normally resist being photographed. Broomberg and Charnarin co-opted this technology. They used it to construct an archive of contemporary Russia. They produced the same exhaustive archive in under 3 days. These images are low resolution and fragmented. Their success is determined only by how precisely the machine can identify us.
I mean, it's almost quaint. I'll jump through this because obviously August Sander was the kind of catalyst to the work. But what we landed up doing was going to Moscow and casting 260 people. So we essentially enacted August Sander's Citizens of the 20th Century, which took him his lifetime in 3 days using this technology. And this was just before it was rolled out to every government. So every time you walk through a main street or an airport, this is happening right now to us. But what we decided to do, and why I brought the project was, in fact, all photography, as we know, but particularly this project, is data itself. And we worked with a kind of small startup, kind of NGO based at the New Museum in New York called Collectors, and we launched an edition, and the idea was to actually, the edition would be to purchase the data instead of an object or instead of a print or instead of, and the only thing that authenticated this, the originality, since the aura of the artist is totally gone, was that it had a blockchain certificate attached to it. So in essence, we were happy for people to share the data with, 1,000 of their friends, and they could reproduce it, but only one of them had essentially the kind of, I don't know, what Walter Benjamin would say is the aura, and whether we could equate the aura with the blockchain, I don't know. But I want to stop talking because I've actually got a lot more questions than I do have answers, so that's it.
Right, thank you so much, Adam. Basically, just to give you a more technical overview from these works, what they did in more technical terms was actually generating a certificate that's built on top of the Bitcoin blockchain, and this certificate is via the site collectors and Verisart. So most of us here are basically from another blockchain, that's Ethereum, and we also have certificates. Some of them are in the shape of smart contracts, or some of them are in the shape of ERC 721. But let's go back to the root of all of these. And first, I'm gonna just switch the questions a little bit, and I'm gonna ask you all, do you see any particular ideologies or philosophies that could cause problems for the intersection of blockchain art and, for example, surveillance capitalism?
Go on.
Well, it depends on whose perspective.
I'm asking for yours.
Well, for me, it's potentially very progressive. I mean, when I sell a piece of work, if I sell a piece of work, it's gone, and it only accrues value over time when it reaches the secondary market. And if something's built into a blockchain where every time it's sold, 30% of that sale goes back to the artist or the artist's estate, I think that's the smallest gesture. But I think also we all know that the art market is the most crude and crooked market known to man. And if the blockchain does what it says it does, which I am still not sure, then Larry Gagosian can't be selling his work to Larry Gagosian and selling the work back to Larry Gagosian and selling the work back to Larry Gagosian and then putting it on the art market, because the blockchain would record that. So if it does suggest the transparency that we hope it can deliver, then I think it's potentially a very progressive force that would get rid of a lot of money laundering, to say the least.
Do you want to go on?
No, you
there?
go.
Well, I'm interested in kind of a slightly different angle of, I don't think there's any kind of philosophical reasons for there to be an awkwardness between blockchain and art, but I'm very interested in what art or cultural work can do for us to understand blockchain better, and what blockchain can do. I think there's a tendency to think about both blockchain, but also markets, networks, protocols, these kinds of things, as tools that allow us to do something. And we tend to think about tools in a slightly neutral way, that it's like, oh, but I'm just using this in order to get this thing done. But in actual fact, money, markets, blockchain, protocols, networks, they do have qualitative effects as well. They create certain kinds of relationships between people. They create certain kinds of ways of being together, which means they create certain kinds of culture that comes kind of like, that is kind of imminent to the technology itself. And so for me, the interesting overlap between art and blockchain is really for artists to kind of crunch through that problem, to really work with blockchain, work with markets, work with money as mediums, as material, to explore the limits of these things, both in terms of like what these things can do, but also, and most importantly, really like the limits to what they could or should do. What in what kinds of relationships, what kinds of contexts do we want these technologies to mediate between us, and what kinds of relationships and what kinds of contexts do we really not? So kind of working a little bit with the appropriateness, playing around a little bit with experimentation of what feels right or not, or what kind of cultural outcomes happens through a kind of deeper engagement in that sense. For me, that's the interesting task of kind of artist or cultural engagement with blockchain as a technology.
Right. So yeah, like McLuhan says, the medium is the message, and I think that actually we can express ideas, and we can actually turn those protocols into currencies and whatnot, into art, and manifest what's going on actually in the society as well, or what we are concerned of. So what's your perspective on the means? Oh, sorry, just on the ideologies that could be intermediating between us and these technologies.
This topic goes off in so many different directions at once. It's kind of hard to. It's all really unruly, basically. I think one of the things that we learn from the web is that the technologies are understood to have a set of affordances, and one of the things that we understood really early, as the blockchain was emerging, was that everyone from right across the political spectrum were claiming it as their own and saying that it was going to create their utopia. And so the interesting things that I think the artists are doing is that they're looking at the affordances of the technologies and then pushing it to see whether it can make a particular speculative reality come true. But I think that one of the most useful things it does is that it reminds us that tools are always used against their initial purpose, what they were designed for, and that you have this complete constant slippage between what happens on the symbolic realm and then what the tool is being used for in the social, financial, and a kind of the more technical realm. And we just need to remember that these things stay complex, that they're going to produce worlds that we don't expect. And the thing that we have enjoyed doing most is bringing people from across different disciplines into things like live action role plays to imagine themselves into the future worlds that might be created. Because I think the worst thing we can do is imagine that we know what it's going to do and then feel comfortable and safe.
Thank you, Ruth. So, Peter, can you offer some perspective from your practice?
Yeah, I think so. So I think that I think it's very interesting to see how artists have started to kind of explore the technology, particularly as a way to kind of register assets on a sort of ledger immutably, both in sort of financial terms and others. And I think that's the sort of space that we're exploring. So one of the projects that we're looking at is is it possible to kind of create an open language for art, so a sort of substrate to any kind of interfaces that you might want to build, so that the data isn't sort of siloed in lots of different places. It's actually sort of shared across a sort of much more open and transparent sort of strata. And then I think that might encourage more sort of experimentation around how that data is actually sort of used, accessed, managed, and sort of moved around. That, you know, the sort of art economy does suffer from a bit of an issue of a sort of burden around the kind of management and sort of inefficiencies around the way that information is moved. So, for example, on artwork, there's lots of information about an artwork which is consistent, but often that's duplicated many times over the lifetime of an artwork. But one of the other places that we were exploring is also the way in which artists could start to experiment around the way that their practice is actually sort of funded, and sort of connecting with communities to potentially try and create some sort of symbiotic relationship in that process. So, you know, could artists mint a form of a token, so their own sort of form of cryptocurrency, and then could they encourage then a community of people to participate in some way holding that currency to sort of part fund the practice over time. There are sort of regulatory issues for sure that need to be overcome to really enable that kind of solution. And I think also in conversation with artists, there's a lot of anxiety around what that might mean for their practice and how they then communicate to sort of the outside world, and in some ways their practice being represented by, you know, a kind of graph that fluctuates over time. But I think there's lots of, you know, interesting spaces to explore, and I think for us I do think the technology itself and also the kind of culture that's emerging around that technology does present the possibility of a sort of more dynamic future where we sort of root ourselves in order, perhaps a little less quickly, or that we can actually sort of move through the process from kind of new opportunity or new potential to order and back again much more sort of dynamically. And I think that's one of the things that we're most interested in with the sort of technology.
Can I say something?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so I think it's you're reminding me of things by talking. So I think we have a kind of internal model of the art world which is pyramidical and very centralised. So there's often artists, definitely in the UK, who go to art school. They kind of have this idea that if they're good and they're lucky, that they will find themselves moving up the pyramid and being collected by an increasingly small number of collectors who have an increasing access to the resources. And what I think Peter's pointing at is a potential for this bottom layer of the pyramid, where we have a lot of artists who are barely making a living and who aspire to be able to rethink what art might mean to more people, to actually rethink what the relationship might be between artists and a whole load of different people, whether it's on the ground or connecting transnationally. And I think that these kind of some of the blockchain technologies are allowing people or inspiring people to think actually what the role of art might be through the new relationships that it can create. And that's the excitement, I think.
Well, I mean, again, it just depends on how much traction it's got. You know, I think because in 2 years' time you could hold one of these and 3 people will come, and I think if it does have traction, it could be the most radical thing possible from the point of view of, you were talking about collective ownership in terms of collective production, so that this idea of the kind of genius author artist falls away, the idea of the kind of aura of the object, because in fact if we're dealing with data, and if people do start accepting the idea that data itself is valuable, if it has some kind of authentic certificate or security, whatever, I think that's a radical change. You know, we're still in the mode of Rodin. You know, we're pretending we can only make 15 casts of something, and you know, each one's worth $93.8 million, and in fact they're reproducible endlessly. But the art world creates this kind of nonsense fiction. And when I speak to the directors of my 2 main galleries, they oscillate between absolute doubt about this stuff, because they've heard so much about how it's kind of volatile, it's dangerous, it's not stable, or like sheer panic, because if something like collective ownership, collective production, the artist being in charge of actual, you know, distribution as opposed to this little sheltered employment that's every, you go to Basel right now, it's a corral of kind of the 1% of the 1%, and they are desperate to keep control of that. So I think there's a radical potential here, but I've heard lots of doubts, and I've read in lots of pieces that there are technological problems still. So until those are solved, then we can't fight the fight.
Can I just ask a question on that topic to all three of you, actually, because I don't really work in the art economy, but I'm wondering, because what you're saying just now sounds kind of, to me, as far as I can kind of remember, sounds a little bit similar to kind of the hopes and ideas of the internet more generally. So what was the missing piece that maybe blockchain is providing, or like what's changed? I don't know, Ruth, maybe you also have something to say on that.
Yeah, I mean, I really resist. I can sometimes come across as a blockchain evangelist, which then has me waking up sweating in the middle of the night, because that's not how I kind of perceive myself, and I think it's very problematic. But if we talk about the missing piece is actually having some say in the relationship between decision making and money flows. That's actually really exciting. So the potential to start to make new cooperative forms and to involve people in the creation of cooperative forms for getting organised, that's the bit that the web wasn't really allowing us to do. It wasn't allowing us to formalise that and actually sign up for it and commit and all of those kind of things.
And I think that sort of speaks to just another point, which is like the ability to sort of experiment. And I think it's a little bit hard at the moment to sort of experiment with regard to the sort of relationship an artist might want with a gallery, the market, or whatever else. And I think that the technology and the culture that's sort of emerging around that potentially offers the ability to sort of experiment with these more open, dynamic ways of doing things. So, for example, it seems to be the case that there is some recognition now that the data that's kind of compiled and emerges from a studio over time is actually quite important. I think certainly if you speak to artists who are a few years into their career, possibly a decade into their career, they start to recognize the value in sort of archiving and documenting and kind of taking ownership over that. Whereas you speak to sort of younger artists, it's maybe not just something so familiar to them, or they don't sort of see the value in that. But that actually counts for a lot, because as soon as the sort of ownership and responsibility over that information is passed to somebody else, actually what happens with that can be quite kind of important. So I think that the technology is sort of pressing us to explore these new ways in which you could present artists, and the kind of communities and sort of actors within the art economy who in effect coalesce around artists. It just sort of presses the question: what could this relationship be, as opposed to what it looks like at the moment, there being this kind of templated format, which is quite difficult to shift from right now. And I think maybe the technology can help in that way.
The other really exciting thing about this is that what it does is that it enables us to actually look at things that have been very hidden and abstracted for a really long time, which is actually, especially from the artist's perspective, the very complex relationship between art value and money. And there's been all kinds of reasons why it's been in the interests of a large group of people, actually not just in the art world, but outside of the art world, to kind of keep the functioning of finance and money and organisation processes kind of in the kind of collective unconscious. Because when you actually start to look at it, we might find ourselves asking some quite difficult and political questions. And so one of the things that excites me is that by inviting artists to get involved in thinking about where the value actually lies, and to think about how they want to reposition themselves in relation to other people in the art world or art worlds, that's starting to invite people to have a more critical relationship to questions of the financialization of life generally.
But for the art world, as in the art power, it's also critical. And I think they're in a cul-de-sac, because until 10 years ago, the value of a work relied on its rarity, right? So you could only make a few things. You actually denied a lot of people seeing it. And now there are algorithms that clearly show that the more a lousy, low-resolution Instagram photograph is taken of a painting and distributed, the value goes up, literally overnight. Whereas once only 15 people ever had access to that painting in its entire life, right? And so it was, so these, you know, the big blue chip galleries are dealing with this kind of strange contradiction where it's like they need popularity, but they're trading in rarity, and so they're fucked. And
but you have that on the one hand, which is but when you're talking about value there, you're talking about the price. You're actually talking about price, I think.
No, I'm not, because I think that at one point, we now know it's like it's more fixed than the greyhound races, right? But the point is, at one point it was that there were only 2 produced, and it took a lifetime to produce it, and its value had a real value, a tangible value, not like the London housing market, which is not, you know, it's not made of bricks and mortar. But I think the art market's even worse, and it's, but once they kind of, you know, the gallerists were the kind of brick wall between. They would choose who was allowed into the hallowed halls of being a collector. Now everybody with a camera or an Instagram thing, and they need those teenagers to do it, and in fact they need the popularity. So what I'm saying is it's both the financial value, but it's also the so-called kind of critical value is being determined by people with an iPhone, you know.
And I think also to some degree the sort of the kind of lag to some degree of the narratives and the stories that artists are kind of almost uniquely able to kind of explore and create, and the diffusion of those to people. And I find that quite interesting. If you look at the system at the moment, to some degree, it actually does a reasonable job of containing that, at least for a period of time, and sort of diffusing that as and when the system or the actor within the system wants to. And we obviously understand why, and that's as it is, that's the way the sort of system works. But if you think about the sort of value of art other than the kind of commercial value, which is this kind of like, you know, I think there are some, you know, very good sort of like definitions of this, but the way in which, you know, it might help us sort of understand our reality and environment better, and so on and so forth. There's significant sort of value there, but what's necessary is that people sort of believe that art is for them, that those narratives and those stories are accessible to them to some degree, even though they might be quite difficult to reason with or sort of grapple with. But belief in those narratives is fundamental, and I think that the system does, to some degree, erect a bit of a barrier. At the very least, a time lag between those sort of narratives and the stories that artists are exploring and the way they then get consumed through broader culture.
But I think your point was the most important, because if you look at the history of kind of institutional critique, I think that people making work not only using blockchain, but about blockchain, is what the avant-garde has always done. And I think that that's the most important thing, is that we're much better, we're more adept, and we've got much less to lose when we are critical about these things, as opposed to just kind of saying, wow, look at this new Ferris wheel, you know what I mean? And I think if we left it to the gallerists or to Vodafone, we'd be, you know, it would be a tragedy. And that's why the art world is important, I think. And that's what, I guess that's what you were saying. And I really,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I like from your conversations, I can see that there's actually, you know, a really important paradigm shift. So first of all, it's a new economy that actually, you know, this replication of the art of art is creating, and also, you know, if we can get blockchain technologies into obviously what's reproduction rights and what's the secondary market, then we would also help shift this economy. But also, it's a matter of, and as Peter mentioned, of accessibility. So, you know. Adam just said, okay, there's just a few of them, of the artists that are actually in Basel right now. Well, you know, some of us are here and we're working on art, and we're actually trying to lower the accessibility barriers. How do you guys think that we could actually help and, you know, form a collective to generate wider accessibility and paradigm shift in terms of economy?
Well, again, like, I'm not so much part of the kind of art economy directly, personally, but I do think and write a lot about access and blockchain. And there is kind of, there's problems here. Because what blockchain, in some senses, can partially enable is like very fine-grained management of access, actually. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending. And so there's more work to be done, let's say. You know, it's not as easy to just, you know, invent a token and then all of a sudden it's like you've gained loads of economic power and we rise up as a kind of self-organized collective and we defeat the powerful. You know, power operates across a variety of fields and needs to be addressed across a variety of fields. And so this question of access is a tricky one. It's like that needs to be really looked at quite carefully. Sometimes, you know, enabling access and denying access, you know, basically I guess what I'm saying is like it's important to think about words like open and closed in quite sophisticated, complex ways, because openness can sometimes enable the powerful to come in and take over. And closeness can sometimes, you know, create a kind of zone of exclusion. So understanding when and how those dynamics operate and who you're actually really working for is quite important. Yeah, sorry to make that very abstract, but yeah, if that makes sense.
No, you're right. I'm really curious on Peter's and Ruth's point of view here because you have been working with DAOs and ArtxN as well is working with you know, wider accessibility. So can you please explain what are you doing, guys, to help this?
I mean, I think it's interesting because like, two things spring to mind. So one is that there's a lot of new platforms out there, like for crypto collectibles. So these feel to me like a blockchain equivalent of DeviantArt, and so it's kind of popular platforms for people to make rare digital things that can then be sold and collected. And I was a bit kind of snooty about them at first because they seemed like a reproduction of commodity form artworks that were just like, so you're just basically trading images, and this felt a little bit lacking in potential to me. But the communities that have formed around them and the conversations and this sense of self-empowerment is actually really interesting. But so you have that on the one hand, but on the other hand you have artists who are doing these deep dives into narratives, the connection to historic art movements. So a number of people have been talking about, you know, like the 20th century tradition of artist collectives forming around manifestos, and then thinking about how you might be able to institute manifestos as DAOs. So if we say we all agree this, then actually now theoretically it's possible for us to say, well, okay, if we all agree it, let's all sign up to this thing, and this contract will make this it will basically make a manifesto as an organization that we can all organize around. So I think because the technology that I think there seems to be general agreement that 2019 is the year when DAO experiments are actually starting to become possible, because the technology ecology is kind of starting to kind of come into, it's becoming more accessible to people who aren't deeply talented developers, so we can play a little bit more. So I think this is where we're going to see some things happening. Peter?
I think I would obviously sort of reiterate a lot of that. I think it's I think it's about trying to sort of make these tools accessible to artists so they can experiment with them in a way that doesn't necessarily locate them in any one particular platform. So anything that they're able to do with one thing, they should be able to sort of extract that data and information and use it with something else. But really sort of trying to think about, you know, the sort of at a lower level, not trying to sort of implement too many instructions or rules, so that a lot more of the sort of interesting stuff can be built around and built on. You know, and I think that the blockchain space, one of the things that it's doing, it seems, is really laying out some unique and interesting ways to organize around an idea, or as Ruth was describing, sort of manifesto. to build these sort of new digital services or products to some degree. And I think that also is pretty interesting.
What was important about manifestos or the purpose of manifestos is that they were always, manifestos exist to basically assert a new meaning and role for art in the world. So it's what seems to me important is that we're getting narratives that go deep about artists' relationship to the world and why the world needs or should care about art, and then manifesting this in organisational form. And while it's just about new ways for people to pick up bits of things that they like, a kind of consumer model, this is less interesting, I think. Right. But when we really start to think about what's the world need from art now, and for artists to be involved in making that narrative, this is important.
Right, but of course manifestos are not only for the art world. We have the Cyberpunk Manifesto, which I think that a lot of us can actually get hooked into and then get into blockchain because of that particular manifesto, or another, the self-sovereign identity manifesto as well. How does actually someone that's more in the art world see, what's the bigger hook from more of the technology that you would see?
I mean, I think the blockchain's had a hideous birth. It's come out of kind of Ivana Trump's vagina because of its association with cryptocurrency. So it's got this kind of tainted atmosphere to it, and I think our task is to reorientate it and to create an atmosphere, a progressive atmosphere around it. And I think it's quite interesting the way you've structured, not you, but the way this has been structured. Like just before us was the health sector, and I would have really wanted to be in there. And I bet you a couple of them, and this is the way the world is screwed, is that we've got this brand new technology. Artists, like I said, have less to risk because they've got less capital, they've got less people's lives to save, and yet they could be really helpful to the health sector. And I think, if these things if we were just thrown into a thing and I wasn't sitting with 4 people speaking the same language, it might be quite interesting. But my main point is I think that I don't know, I'm an eternal optimist, and I think this thing feels like, I got really excited about it in the beginning, it feels like maybe in the 1930s with the surrealists and the original manifestos, where it was like, my God, we can rewrite the rules, and I don't know, I don't want to get carried away, but I think that it could be a really exciting time if it's not just taken over by, if it's not just commodified and 5G'd or whatever.
Right, but it has been already commodified, so we need to figure it out, and I think that one of the most interesting ways to actually start figuring it out and raising collective consciousness is actually turning all these feelings that you're saying, the Ivana Trump analogy and everything, and then, putting all of those into artworks, which is what a lot of people, for example, at Furtherfield are doing, provoking and then sparking consciousness from, what the artwork says, not by, enabling a new form of funding, right?
Yeah, I mean, so we've been putting exhibitions together of artists who are working with blockchain as a medium and as a subject, and one of my favourite really early blockchain artworks was the Plantoid by Primavera de Filippi, which is an android plant that dances and glows for Bitcoin or Ethereum tips. And as you tip it, it accumulates more money, and when it reaches a certain level, it then commissions an artist to make its babies. And if you've tipped it, then you get to set some of the conditions of the baby's behaviour. And this includes its kind of governance. So there are now 16 plantoids. There might be more actually, but the last time I heard there were 16 plantoids. Some of them are charitable. Some of them had rules about how they could travel, about how big they were, about the kinds of people that could own them. So this is a really interesting work that is thinking about the evolution of the relationship between governance and aesthetics. And when these kind of, the world starts to go wavy once you start to realize all the things that might be possible.
But maybe we can also take the language down one notch. I'm working, like I said, with this really interesting collective called Collectors in New York. So 95% of all contemporary artwork is currently in storage. So it won't be seen by any of you in your lifetime. And their mission is to basically go in, digitize it, attach it to a crypto, what's it called? The blockchain certificate, so it will be authenticated, and make it accessible not only to the kind of fancy curators who've gone to Yale and can travel to UAE and dig into the archives, but to everybody. And I think it's kind of the difference between what a DJ is, or originally was, who just had a great big collection of records, and a remixer who can kind of have access to stuff that has never been accessible to them and can kind of make new things with it, right? I think that's also really interesting.
Right, that's interesting. But for example, well, I tried getting in touch with collectors to ask them more, and the fact that these people actually don't have the proper information to express artists and to educate artists, that concerns me a little bit, and that's a problem that I have also been discussing with Ruth beforehand. How do we educate people? How do we bring them into this kind of awareness? So I think that we're about to wrap up, but I would like to ask you, what are actually your hopes for, this new movement, and do you see something as blockchain art popping up?
I think there already is blockchain art. Some of the examples that were mentioned was really good. So instead of answering your question more, I just want to make one last kind of observation that, for me, and again to come back to this question of like working with blockchain, token creations, money, markets, this kind of thing, as mediums to really explore, how they affect our relationships between each other, as something that is like an important task for artists and so on. Because it was interesting to hear that you were concerned with that blockchain has already been is commodified. And it's just funny because, like, yeah, I can see what you mean, but on the other hand, it already always was and always will be. I mean, it's a technology that's there to define property.
Of course, yeah.
Like, and so to not acknowledge that that's the fact is, like, I think it's important to acknowledge that that is the fact, and what that enables us to do if we look at this technology that is there to define and secure property, it enables us to look at what's the edges of that? What can we experiment with the property relationship? Is there anything there that we like? Is there anything there that we dislike? And how does it affect our relationships, really? Before we start just kind of like plonking this technology for defining property onto everything, right? So it's a nice kind of, I think it's something that's like worth really looking at quite carefully. That's my hope, actually, is that kind of critical engagement. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my hope is, so the blockchain art that I think is most important is the work that helps us get better distinctions and to see what's happening in this tension between art as market and art as an example of the total financialization of everything, all living systems on the one hand, and the agency that we might take to see that what is important is how we relate to each other and care for each other as part of a living system, and how we care for living systems. And I think that just using blockchain presents a really interesting lens to be able to look at both of those things and to connect with people who actually have some, they're some of the people who are actually able to make a difference in that tension.
Yeah, so for me briefly, it's ways in which the technology and the sort of culture that's emerging around the way these tools are built can sort of take the existing art economy, which is sort of laid out on top of artists and the works they create, and experiment around that system. And in particular, sort of collapsing the space between artists and audience so that the stories and narratives that artists work on can diffuse faster through to broader culture.
Any closing remarks?
Yeah, I've got a question. So we all know what intellectual property is, right? And in theory, we could attach a blockchain certificate or blockchain thing to intellectual property. But could there be such a thing as emotional property? So if I make a three-dimensional rendition of a boat full of refugees drowning in the Mediterranean, could I be sued using... And what I'm trying to say is blockchain is not only a tool, but it's also fodder. It's also a material, right?
Exactly.
And I think that that's really important. And I look forward to smoking a big fat blockchain.
All right, so thank you so much, guys. I didn't ask any of my questions because you all have a lot to say, but I hope this was exciting, and I really advise you to check out Furtherfield. And if you're curious about blockchain and art, go to our Twitter, ethberlin. We just released the paper that should explain you all a little bit about the intersection. All right, thank you so much.